Welcome to All About Genealogy.
I'm Leslie.
And I'm Marie.
And this is our first introductory episode of what we hope will be a very popular place for genealogists to gather information, smash those brick walls, and solve some mysteries. We'd like to start off by giving you a little background on how we got here. I had been interested in family history and genealogy from about the time I was 8 years old. And I was lucky enough to grow up in an apartment building with grandparents and great-grandparents, a couple of aunts and uncles who at different times lived in the apartments in our building. I was fascinated by my great-grandparents and their siblings who would come to visit, and the stories these people would tell were awesome. I would make a habit of writing these stories down, and those stories would later be the foundation of my love of genealogy. And so later, much later, I would enroll at the University of Toronto to get my certifications in librarianship and genealogical studies, and turn a lifelong hobby into a professional career. Marie and I actually became friends about 3 years ago. Yeah. When she came to the genealogy club that I was sponsoring, and she knew a lot then. She knows a lot more now, and we're so happy to have her.
Thank you. Well, my interest began in my family history when I was a child also. My maternal side hails from Tennessee and is a really large family, and we've been in the same area for an extended period of time. I remember at family reunions and family get-togethers, meeting people and my mother and my aunties saying, "Oh, well, you're related to that person." But as a child, you really don't know how you're related to someone, you just know their family. So I also made a decision that I wanted to know those people, and I wanted to know a little bit more about where they came from. And I heard stories. Of course, as a child, you hear things that you don't really understand, but as you grow older, they start to make more and more sense. And of course, just like with most Americans that have been in the United States for an extended period of time, you always have the story about the Native American ancestor. And I wanted to know more about her and understand what her life was like. Now, on my dad's side, his family, I thought, was a really small family, and they had a family fire back in the 40s where we lost all pictures and documents and everything. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about his family. We thought it was really small. But after I started my research, I found that that was not the case. I've met some neat people, and I've figured out that my dad's side of the family is pretty large. And from that point, I just wanted to know more. And so this morphed into a real passion and a real drive for researching and knowing even more about my roots. And little did I know that here I would be, that this drive would end up recording a YouTube video and hanging out with you and all of our friends in our genealogy club.
Absolutely. Okay, so now that we have the introductions out of the way, it's time to get down to business. Our mission over the coming weeks is to bring you some fresh ideas, interject a little genealogy methodology, which is just a fancy way of saying order, and maybe make you laugh a time or two.
And even cry.
Yeah, that might happen too. There are many genealogy sites, blogs, and vlogs out there that are excellent, and hopefully we'll be reviewing some of those too, along with starting you on your way to becoming an organized and well-rounded genealogist.
And the key word is organized.
Yes, absolutely. So today we'd like to start your journey, the journey with you by discussing federal census records. Census records are far and away the easiest way to get your feet wet as a beginning genealogist. The federal government holds a census every 10 years for the purpose of counting the population of the United States. The first census recording was 1790, and then after was taken every 10 years. The last census recorded was in 2010. In the late 18th century, 19th century, and mid-20th century, a person called an enumerator would knock on your ancestor's door and ask an ever-expanding base of questions based on the people who lived in your house or apartment. Around the turn of the last century, it's kind of different in different regions. The Census Bureau started mailing census questionnaires out for the public to fill out. So now they don't have to send enumerators anymore. They just mail them to everyone. So here are some of the things that you can learn from census records over the years. You can learn your ancestors' first and last names and the correct spellings of their names, the name of the head of their household, because it's not always necessarily the dad, it might be a grandparent. Your ancestors' marital status, which starting on the 1850 census, it shows all that, and the name of their spouse and all the other people that lived in the house with them. Their gender, sometimes, a name might be, could be male or female, so you know the gender. Their ages, their occupations, their wage compensations, and on most censuses they ask, interestingly enough, if your ancestor lived on a farm, which I never understood, but I mean the enumerator would kind of know that, but I guess the people at the Census Department wouldn't know
have
that.
known that.
Right. So they have to have that information. And here are some of the things that you can discover that you may not have known. Were they single? Were they married? Divorced? Widow or widower? Sometimes we're not clear on when our great-great-grandfather died, and so you can kind of pinpoint it by a census record sometimes. Did another family member live with them, such as a parent or a niece or a nephew? Were they a wage worker or a salaried worker? And that's important because, before the advent of unions, wage workers were laborers, carpenters, masons, plumbers, what have you. Salaried workers generally earned more, and they were doctors, lawyers, and such. Did they come from another country? And if so, what year did they come? What year did they emigrate? What country was it that they came from? And another thing is what language did they speak? And also, too, they asked if you speak English. And this is a really important one. Can you read and write? That's really important because a lot of farm kids couldn't read or write. And that's kind of sad. But
Yeah, it was. When slaves were brought to the United States, unfortunately, they were not considered human. They were treated and considered as property, which is really sad. Every slave owner assigned a dollar amount to their slaves, and it was no different than a cow, horse, or even a goat. Many people refuse to acknowledge that fact, but it is supported by the federal slave census and slave schedules from the United States. Unless you were free, no black person was recorded on the general census of the United States by identity. Now, in many cases, some people were able to pass by another nationality. So if that were the case, there are free blacks that are noted on the censuses of the United States, but they were misidentified because they were passing as another nationality.
Right.
So in 1850 and in 1860, a separate count of slaves was taken within the United States because they wanted to understand how the population of this land was growing. So these slave schedules were little more than an inventory of people. Slave owners were listed by name, And then the slaves were noted either by sex age, and in some cases there were notes about color. Were they medium brown? Were they dark brown?
That's really interesting.
Yeah, which is really sad. But again,
Yeah.
if it's an inventory of your property, how do you identify your property?
Yeah.
And this inventory happened in the 1850s and the 1860s, and which is the document is called a slave schedule. And it ended in 1870 after emancipation, where the slaves were then given their ability to have a first and a last name.
Yay.
Yay. And have their identifiers noted as a part of the population of the United States. Slaves were finally listed by name. So the African American brick wall is a little difficult and a little more challenging than in a lot of cases. Because remember, we had no individual identity, and in a lot of cases, the only identity the slaves had were by their slave owner. And so outside of understanding that slave owner, finding out that this person lived in a particular spot was very challenging. But there are ways to do it, and we can talk about that in another video. So now let's talk about doing a census search. So think of a census search as a drill down. Start with the name, first and last, then continuing adding elements such as age, maybe state, maybe city, spouse, or other family members. Just because you don't get an immediate hit of an ancestor, it doesn't mean that the information isn't there.
Right.
Sometimes you might just have to alter spelling or just do a search over the first name and maybe a last initial. It's not always just going to be presented to you like on a platter. You may need to start and spend a long period of time. How long have you spent searching through page after page
Absolutely.
of results until you find that exact ancestor that you were searching for?
Absolutely.
But don't get discouraged. As a genealogist, you cannot get discouraged. You just have to keep drilling down. You may have to find do different versions of your search until you find that right ancestor. But patience is the key. You have to be patient.
And we also have to remember that when you're filling in those search fields at Ancestry or whatever site you're on, this is not a fill-in-the-blanks exercise. You don't have to put in a bunch of things into the search fields. Start out with the person's name. And then
Start simple.
Right, and then you can add what you think maybe be their birth date or the state that they lived in, or maybe you know the state that they were born in. Just add one thing at a time, hit search, see what you come up with, and then go from there. But this is not a fill-in-the-blanks exercise. You don't have to fill in everything at once. So now that you have all this paper and information, where do you put it after you print it? How do you find it again in what's sure to become a growing paper pile? And there's some lore in genealogist circles that you go to bed with 15 papers on your desk, and when you wake up, there's like 150 papers.
You wonder, where did they all come from?
You don't know where they came from, right? So we'll be discussing organizations or organization of all your papers and genealogy finds in another episode. For now, you can go to any office supply store and get some page protectors and a 3-ring binder to store your papers in. And trust me on this, please do this because you'll thank us.
Organization is a key, because what you want to make sure is that as you're working, it may be late at night, and you may find something and you want to be able to find it again.
Right.
So make sure that you do this in an organized fashion. That way you can recreate
Absolutely.
searches and your finds.
Absolutely. So before we go, we'd like to invite you to ask questions in the comment section below. And if you have any specific problems or brick walls,
or even research topics.
Absolutely. We may use your suggestions or questions in an upcoming episode and hopefully resolve your problem. Also, if you like this video, please click on the thumbs up icon. You can also subscribe to the series as well, and you'll be notified every time we upload a new video. So thanks for joining us today. And remember, if you don't have source citation, it's not genealogy.